thank you for being here. I'm Kate Canine, Professional Development Specialist for Poudre School District, along with Dwayne Schmitz, Director of Research and Evaluation. In our time together, we're going to provide an overview of PSD's Student Learning Objectives, or SLOs, and how these connect within educator effectiveness, as well as the inquiry cycle of professional collaboration and evaluation. So Dwayne, can you share with us how can the PSD staff and the community that we serve find up-to-date information related to educator effectiveness?
Absolutely, Kate. So on the PSD homepage, there's a link on the upper right-hand side called Educator Effectiveness right under Focus Projects. If you click that link for Educator Effectiveness, you'll open up the Educator Effectiveness page and you'll see a series of informational links. There's some PDF type information, there's some videos a little down lower on the page. There's information that has to do with the professional practice side of our evaluation process, and there's some information that has to do with the student growth or student outcome 50% of the evaluation. At any rate, if you click on the PSD Student Learning Objective Guide link, you'll open up a 30-page guide that details out a lot of information that has to do with what we're talking about today, and we'll just do a brief overview.
Great. So within this SLO guide, are there multiple versions of the guide? One for teachers, a second one for administrators, etc.?
Great question. And the answer is no. From the beginning, PSD has been very clear. We want one source of information for all users, so there's not different stories about what the languages we should be using and how SLOs are designed. So we have one guide intended for all users, the public, the teachers, principals, everybody.
So, since we're providing just an overview here, tell us, if you had to sum up what an SLO is in 30 seconds or less, what would you say?
All right. I would say that an SLO is actually a very flexible way of gathering evidence around educator effectiveness. It is a system that makes sense for all educators, no matter what their teaching assignment, because we have teachers of all types, as you know, art, music, PE, math, language arts, career and tech ed. There's all types of assignments out there. So the SLO process is very flexible. It's designed to gather information from the current year students that teachers are actually interacting with. It's basically premised on this idea of backward design, which is something a lot of educators have been doing for a long time. Simply, what are we teaching? What are the teaching learning targets? How will we know when kids know it? And so on back, we're designing to the instructional stages.
And how, for teachers to make some connections here, where does an SLO fit in within the overall teacher evaluation process?
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to point our attention to this slide. The overall evaluation process under Senate Bill 191 has become a little more complicated. There's basically two big pieces to the puzzle. There's a 50% that's professional practice, which is on the left-hand side of this diagram in the blue puzzle piece. Professional practice are all those adult behaviors that we've been evaluating with teachers and educators for longer than you and I have been teachers. So we're familiar with that, although there have been some changes and revisions in Poudre School District recently. But on the right-hand side of this diagram, the yellow puzzle piece is the student growth component. By law, the student growth component has to be weighed at 50% of the overall evaluation. Our student growth component is kind of separated into two major stages. The first stage we call Strata 1 and Strata 2, which are really like a statistical process that we run from the district based on common assessment data and state and local assessments that we all share in common. But where the SLO resides is in the second stage, which is called the third strata, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And basically, PSD is designed a filter system, so we use Strata 1 and 2 to find evidence of effectiveness where it's easily spotted based on these other high-level exams. But the SLO allows us to dig in to what teachers might find more relevant in their classroom data and the students they're working with in the current year.
And within that, when we look at evaluation for teachers, this is also part of our inquiry cycle, which is PSD's model for professional collaboration and evaluation between teachers and principals. And so all teachers start their year by reflecting on their practice and doing an informal self-assessment. So this helps them then when they go to their pre-inquiry conference with their principal to review their self-assessment and discuss their area of focus for the year. When they're looking at their professional learning for the year, where do they want to focus in? It's during this pre-inquiry conference when a teacher can sit down with their principals and talk about SLOs. The inquiry cycle continues then with the professional learning, those discussions between teacher and principal, informal observations, formal observations, and continues that throughout the year to help both the principal and the teacher grow.
Kate, I think that's a great insight because that really helps tie together the professional practice, the adult behavior piece with the student outcome piece. So that's a nice tie-in.
Definitely. So to go back, now that we've looked at where SLOs fit in, if I'm a teacher and I'm ready to create an SLO, what are those steps? What do I do?
Yeah, let's get down to talking about the steps for creating an SLO. There's basically 5 steps. You can think of it, I mean, we could break this down in a couple different ways, but let's think about 5 steps. The first thing any educator needs to do is they need to indicate what type of SLO they're going to have. We have, we'll see in a second, we have 3 types of SLOs so that the process makes sense for everybody. So they have to decide what type, they have to decide the time frame. What period of instructional time am I going to actually have reflected in my SLO? And then they have to decide what the teaching and learning targets are. What do I expect kids to know and be able to do at the end of this instruction that they may not have been able to do at the beginning of it? So that's really collectively what I would call step 1. Step 2 then is to, once you know what the teaching learning targets are, step 2 would be selecting the appropriate measure of success for students. So there's lots of different types of assessments, and we want to be real clear on this point every time we talk. Performance assessments are appropriate. Paper pencil, selected response type assessments are appropriate. Free response assessments are appropriate. All different types of assessments. So when we say measurements, indicators, assessments, we're talking the full gamut of what educators are used to. But no matter what they are, an educator needs to identify them and select them as appropriate for this purpose. The third step then is, now that you know what measures you're going to use, you really have to identify what is the criteria for student success on that particular measure. Now, it might be a criteria related to performance, or it might be a criteria related to growth. Related concepts, but growth might be where a teacher is deciding to measure how much students have changed over time, as opposed to performance where they might just want to measure did the kids get to a certain point or not. Both are acceptable in an SLO and in SB 191, and I applaud the state for giving us that latitude. The fourth step then, once you know what the student success criteria is, and this is the new step for teachers, quite frankly. The first 3 we're pretty familiar with, but the fourth one is kind of new. A teacher needs to think about, given the students they were actually teaching that year and knowing that they've had some time with those students, so they actually know the students and kind of where they're at, what percentage of those students would they claim that if the student were able to demonstrate proficiency by meeting that student success criteria, that would actually indicate instructional effectiveness, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for evidence of instructional effectiveness. Mm-hmm. And that's a decision that the teacher and the principal make. In fact, all of these are collectively decisions the teacher and principal make together. The teacher will walk in with an understanding of what they're proposing, and they'll have a conversation with the principal, and there'll be an agreement between them on these pieces. So that fourth piece is new, and it's going to take our system a little time to get used to it. I want to mention 2 other pieces here real quick. Most of the time, it's going to be based on some percentage of students meeting some success criteria. That's going to be very common. We'll see that a lot. The second thing I want to mention is, and this comes from one of our PSD teachers who first did this, it would be appropriate to put in criteria into the SLO that's really, it would indicate that the student's data is admissible for this process. As an example, let's think about a criteria where we might say a student has to attend class at least 95% of the time in order for their data to be included in my SLO. I think that's fair. It's hard to imagine judging a teacher on a student's performance when the student, in fact, had missed a lot of class time.
Sure.
Anyways, just a quick point. The fifth and final step, then, is to meet with the supervisor, most likely principal or assistant principal, and go through those prior 4 steps, and both parties need to agree that this is a reasonable approach for gathering evidence of effectiveness, which is what we're doing.
Great. And how is this information captured? Because teachers are going to appreciate a set process, but how is it captured so that in step 5 and beyond, the information is in one place for them?
Great question. Well, we know that before we get into the capture piece, and that was my change on this slideshow last minute, Kate, just so you know. Sorry about that.
That's right.
And our friends in the viewing audience. I just wanted to really quickly go over, there are those 3 types we mentioned. There is a general SLO, which will cover most of the students, most of the time on most of the learning targets that you're working on. Then there's a specific group SLO where you might identify a special group that you want to make sure that you're having success with. It might be English language learners, it might be students with IEPs, it might be gifted and talented students, any particular group. It might be students who you have evidence at the beginning of the year that they came in a grade level or 2 behind. At any rate, you might select a special group to do your SLO with. The third type of group that or SLO we have is called an individual goals SLO. Now, because it says individual goals, some people might mistakenly think it means we're going to evaluate a teacher on the growth of an individual student, and that's not the case. What it means is that some of our teachers have very nuanced assignments where they work with a real small group of kids who have real special needs, and no 2 students' needs are the same. And that's why we pay these instructors to have special skills to work with the individual needs of kids. So for them, this type of third type of SLO makes a lot of sense, where they might pick 5 of the students they work with, and so they'll monitor kind of the progress that those 5 students make and their performance, but no 2 of them will have the exact same success criteria and so on. Hopefully that makes sense. So I slipped that in there, so there was a little additional information. So back to your original question, yes. Kate, which was a great question. How are we going to gather this in kind of a consistent fashion? I think one thing we could agree on, when we're doing something this important and this widespread in our system, we don't want 35 good ways of doing it. We want one way of doing it that has enough consistency that it meets everyone's needs. So we have created a single form that we are going to ask all educators to use. We believe it meets the needs, and we've piloted it, and we'll continue to do so and change as needed. At any rate, I think the best way to go through that form is actually to show you a real example.
Wonderful.
So this year, our assistant superintendents work with some of our educators and principals to work through some actual examples, and so we could learn as a district. And what I'm going to show you is an example that came out of one of our schools in geography and world cultures. The top of the form asks us to fill out information that answers the first 2 steps that we went over, indicate the type, time frame, and learning targets, as well as select the appropriate measures of learning. So I can see that the students being included in this example are 9th through 12th grade students in geography and world cultures. There's about 15 students that are included in this SLO. The interval of instruction is about 6 weeks. I can see it's a general SLO down there on the right-hand side as opposed to specific group or individual targets. The assessment type is a teacher-developed pre-post type design and set of assessments. That's totally appropriate. I'm sure the teachers use these assessments for who knows how many years in their class and has some experience with them, so that's completely appropriate. We don't need to rely on things like just DRA2 and MAP and TCAP. Local assessments are acceptable. And then they have some language down here under the rationale for student growth objective, that standards-based language that we like to see that wherever possible, tie the student learning to the standards-based language that we have. And so this is the top third of the sheet that starts to document the process. The second third of the sheet and looks like this, and it answers the 3rd and 4th step in our bigger process. It identifies student success criteria and it defines the instructional effectiveness criteria. The baseline data section up top kind of lets us know that these students were not already performing at proficient and above levels on these assessments. In other words, there is room for learning. Then down a little bit lower, the criteria by which individual students' scores are going to be judged is clearly indicated. A 70% or better on the post-assessment will indicate the student learning that we're looking for.
So that's our success criteria that we're after.
Very good.
Okay.
That's the student success criteria. Then a little lower on the form, under the expected column on the very bottom there, where it says 70 to 89%, that's clearly indicating to us the percentage of students who need to meet that success criteria of 70% or better in order for this teacher to be scored as a 3, which is meeting expectation on their growth evidence through this SLO process. So that's clearly identified. And then there's a couple other columns that indicate how this teacher would receive a 4 or a 2 or a 1, so a lower rating or a higher rating.
So is it fair, Dwayne, to say at this point, if I were this teacher, my goal, if you will, for this 6-week time for this instruction is at the end of that time for me to say that I have been effective, 70 to 89% of my students will earn a 70% or higher on my assessment that I developed for this unit.
Perfectly said.
Great.
And that would earn you the rating of expected growth or student outcomes for the evaluation process. Wonderful. And most importantly, you actually would have been the teacher that came up with the measures, came up with the criteria. You actually developed this. You did get your principal to sign off on it, and he or she agrees with you, but you developed this, and so it should make sense for you. Another thing I want to mention that we don't have captured in our slides is in PSD we actually run the SLO process twice. We run it once in the fall, and where needed, it's available to a teacher also in the spring. Therefore, a teacher, because we know, especially in the outset of any new process, there's a lot of learning that takes place for all of us. So we know that a teacher may do outstanding work, but may have had some piece of their SLO that didn't quite reflect that work. So they have a learning opportunity, and then they get another shot at that in the spring. And so we built that in as sort of a safety to make sure our system's fair but discerning.
Great. Right.
Yeah. And that is basically the highlights of the SLO process.
Well, thank you very much, Dwayne. Appreciate your time and going through this. We'd like to mention as we close up that there are going to be other videos that we create in the near future. They'll be available on the website, as we showed before. And the next series of videos will actually include both that conversation between a principal and a teacher during the pre-inquiry conference when they're going over an SLO, as well as we hope to create some videos and or other trainings for teachers as they're actually writing the SLOs. If they want to sit down and get some help and think it through, there will be the support for that.
Excellent.
So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.